Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's 12:30, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Organic Management Tactics for Cucurbit Crops. My name is Laura Isles. I'm one of the co-directors for the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center. We're one of 4 regional IPM centers supported by USDA NIFA Crop Protection and Pest Management Regional Coordination Program. And the mission of the Pest Management Centers is to coordinate IPM across the region by sharing and promoting research, extension, and teaching activities. And we're really excited to be sharing information with everyone today about the organic management of cucurbit crops. On today's webinar, we have 4 speakers and they'll be broken up into 2 different sections. So first we'll have Dr. Ajay Nair and Dr. Mark Williams. Ajay is from Iowa State University and Mark's from the University of Kentucky, and they're going to discuss weed management for the first half of our webinar. And then our second 2 speakers are Dr. Ric Bessin and Dr. David Gonthier, both from the University of Kentucky, and they're going to discuss pollination. So we'll stop after our first 2 speakers for questions, and then after the second 2 speakers for questions. But at any time, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll be able to see those questions, and we'll be able to ask those questions for you. And then the panelists will be here available for questions. So I think with that, I will pass it to you, Ajay and Mark, to get us started.
Thank you.
Mark, should I start?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And welcome, everyone. Mark and I are excited to have you here and share some of the research results from an ongoing OREI project that focuses on using mesotunnels in cucurbit crop protection. Now you will ask, what is a mesotunnel? So I would say it's a glorified form of row covers. So you see an image right now here. This is what we define as a mesotunnel system, where you have hoops almost 4 feet high, unlike the row covers, which are lower than that. And we are using this special covering material called Protect Net. So Mark and I will focus in our first section here on how to manage weeds under this Protect Net system. This system is good for insect management, primarily as a mechanical barrier for organic growers. But in that case, how do you go and manage the weeds that will be growing between the rows of your plants? So Mark, next slide, please. Sometimes you have to click on the image, and then if you click next, it will move. Yeah, thank you. So quickly, the main objective of this USDA NIFA project was to document the impact of this netting material, which is slowly gaining more popularity and momentum among our growers in Kentucky, in New York and Iowa. We want to, at the same time, identify appropriate weed management strategies, because if you might not have access to between row areas when you have this mesonet system out there. So we want to focus how to manage weeds in those situations. And of course, we want to collect feedback from our growers, who are the end users of these new techniques or strategies, and want to see what they can provide us as a feedback, so we can improvise this system. So in this study, we are focusing on the cover treatment, which is Protect Net. The crops which all these universities grew were either butternut squash. We are looking at muskmelon. There was also melon, other forms of cucurbits with some of our grower collaborators. And the strategy here is to help and assist organic growers to use some of these techniques. And not that this can be only used in organic systems. We can use apply these systems for conventional growers too. So in terms of weed management, we have split it in such a way that as a grower, how can you manage weeds within those mesotunnel systems using an organic approach? And Mark will expand on that more, on using teff and other cover crops, and some of the conventional approaches which can be integrated into organic systems. When I say conventional, it's not sprayer, it's more about products which you can incorporate to manage weeds. So for example, I will talk a little bit and show you images of weed fabric approach of managing those weeds. So quickly, an intro 101 on ProtectNet. The material we use was a 60-gram material. It comes in rolls which are 300 feet long and 25 feet wide, and relatively heavy material. It costs for this dimension, 25 feet wide by 300 feet long, around $1,000, including shipping. So it's definitely more expensive, but what we are hoping is that this can last for 4 or 5 years. And another advantage of having Mesotunnel with the ProtectNet is there is more airflow, there is more light, and that way you stress your plants less. So just a picture to show you what a ProtectNet looks like. This is how we install it, and I'm sure Mark can explain more on it. His lab has also made some videos that show how to bend these hoops, and Mark can explain that later if you have interest. But these are 1-inch electrical conduits that are bent, 1-inch dia, 10 feet long, and they just like you see in this image, put on top of the rows, and we secure the ProtectNet. In this case, we are using sandbags. We have in the past also used, stones and gravel, to secure them. But we found having a secure system is needed because in a heavy wind, of course, this doesn't fly away as like a row cover would, but still it's good to secure and limit the entry of pests into the system. So in this picture, what you see, the way we are managing weeds in those systems is by using mulch. And this is switchgrass mulch, which we used in the project. This is a broccoli crop in which you see, and in that once we install the Mesotunnel, the ProtectNet system, we don't have access to go in there. And even though we have access, you can see how close those conduits are. It's very difficult to hoe. It's very difficult to do any kind of mowing in there. So that's why we are here today to talk about how can we manage weeds in this system. So this is from a grower collaborator, Jordan Scheibel, Middle Bay Farms in Grinnell. And in this, what he has used is straw, just like the image you saw earlier. You can see 2 rows of his cucurbit crops growing in there. And then what he does is he goes and spreads the straw between those rows. And this can be spread manually, which some of you might have done it. We have done it, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. But what Jordan has done, and if you go to the next image, you'll see he has this square bale, which is chopped, and he has his hose that is running, and he just sprays the hose between the rows. So more of an mechanical way, without breaking your back and less labor, to spread the mulch. So there are ways to spread the mulch where you don't need many people out there with pitchforks to spread. Next image.
And Ajay, this is one from our farm. There's more than one way to spread mulch bales. We have a round bale shredder that we got from England that you can put an entire round bale in the back of, and it'll discharge off both sides simultaneously. You do have to have a secondary worker that spreads the mulch up next to the plastic mulch so that you don't have areas where weeds can grow. But there's several tools that are out there for shredding bales.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's good to bring to focus here that there are different strategies, different methods, and whichever fits for a grower, they can adopt that one. Another approach which we typically used at the on-farm grower collaborator sites, this is at Rodale Institute in Iowa, is use of weed fabric. Relatively easier as compared to the mulch or the straw. This material, weed fabric, is available at many of those ag vendors now. And what we are using is the regular staple. You can see the rows of the cucurbit crops, and between those rows, we roll out the weed fabric. There is some labor involved. As you can see, we want to keep it straight. So somebody has to roll it out, and on 2 sides, we are just pounding the pins in. At the Horticulture Research Station this year, we partially mechanized this process of pounding the pin by using a staple gun, which somebody can just stand and then just just staple. So I think that definitely saves a lot of labor and sitting and bending and knocking those pins down. But weed fabric has been a great way. It helps conserve some moisture as well, and absolutely no weeds until the end of the season. And at the end of the season, we just simply roll it back. We pressure wash it, clean it, and roll it back and put it in the storage. And next year, it's again ready for use. The weed fabric could be of different colors. In this site, you can see we are using the white side up, and because the grower wanted to try that, there'll be more light reflection back into the canopy. So that could help the productivity of the plant, maybe improve photosynthesis. And this also worked great. You don't absolutely have to have the black side, both sides black. You can have the white one also. And depending on the price, which is cheaper, you can choose which you want to use. And finally, a segue into organic systems. You can, if wheat fabric is something which you do not want to use, or if it's more, you would like to take more organic approaches where you have some organic matter that can be turned back into the soil. Teff is one of the cover crops which we have used in this experiment. Mark has used it for several years in their systems at University of Kentucky. We have been experimenting with them, I would say maybe the last 3 or 4 years. It's a great cover crop, drought tolerant. We are using a rate of about 10 tons to an acre for the seeding rate. This is a teff plot just to show you what the cover crop looks like. This is 60 days of growth on teff in the summer. So we seeded middle of June, and the picture was taken roughly middle of or first week of August. And you can see the cover crop waist high, absolutely no weeds in there. It completely smothers any of the weeds. And again, as I said, drought tolerant. One thing to be careful of is when you terminate this cover crop, let's say if you are tilling it under, we had to till that plot twice because the biomass was too much for the rototiller to handle. But this is also a great cover crop to grow between those rows if you don't want to use wheat fabric, if you don't want to use straw, and could be a long-term weed management strategy in those systems. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark, and he'll take it from there.
Thank you, Ajay. So, one of the goals that we've always focused on in this project is to look at different techniques for weed control. There is no perfect way to control weeds in an organic system because crops are different, crop needs are different, the systems that we grow individual crops at vary. And so what we try to look at is the strengths and weaknesses of each kind of approach to weed control. And I think landscape fabric is a fantastic option. It's not perfect, though. It does have its drawbacks. It's more costly. You have to manage it carefully at the end of each season and lay it down. I think it is scale dependent. So we spent a lot of time looking at landscape fabric, and I think it has its place and lots of wonderful attributes. But we've also tried to look at other options. And as Ajay said, teff is one of those. And teff is one that we like a lot because it meets the needs of what we look for in a cover crop in a plasticulture system. We've tried lots of different cover crops over the years, and what we're looking for is one that grows well in between the plastic. It grows well in hot, dry conditions like we have in Kentucky where we are in the summertime. And then most importantly, it does not become a weed itself if it goes to seed. And teff, where we are, we have winters. It does not overwinter and the seeds are not viable. So even if we can't get out and mow it and mow the seed heads off, it does not become a weed for us. And so we've played around a lot with teff over the years. We have a farming apprenticeship program that we run, and our marketing strategy is CSA. So we use it for lots of different crops. So we grow on plastic, everything from tomatoes to squash like this. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the innovations that we've learned along the way on how we manage these different cover crops. And one of the limitations for any cover crop that you're sowing in between plastic is you need to have a good stand density of the cover crop. And for us, when we just put down plastic, and especially if we wait several days or weeks between when the plastics beds are put in and when we transplant, weeds will grow in between the plastic, and the weeds will outcompete a direct sown cover crop like teff. And so what we try to do is do kind of a stale seed bed cultivation before we plant the teff. And we played around with lots of different cultivating options over the years, and we built a tractor. I'll just show you what it looks like here. And so what we do is we put our beds in. We might, depending on the time of year, we might leave the beds in place for several weeks, and we do a cultivation or two to try to suppress weed control or weed seed bank in the top part of the soil. And then we transplant put the hoops in, put the cover crop in, and go forward with the installation of the Meso Tunnels. And so this is a tractor that we use that's common. It was common in Kentucky tobacco culture, but you could take these ideas and apply them either under the belly of a tractor like this one or behind a tractor. The concept is the important part, not the specific way that we're doing it here. So this is an old cultivating tractor that we straddle the beds with, and then we cultivate right up next to the shoulders of the beds and in between the beds on a single pass. And I'll show you kind of a focus point on the belly mounted cultivators here. We use a straight tine cultivator. You can see in the front here, I don't know if my pointer shows here, but a straight tine cultivator that goes up right next to the shoulder of the bed, breaks up the shoulder, and then we have a disc hiller on the back that reforms the side of the bed. And so that's how we get weed control, very shallow, right next to the plastic. And that shoulder of the plastic is the hard part to control weeds on. And if we just sowed teff alone, the weeds would outcompete it at the beginning. So we really, for us, we feel like we need this cultivation, 1 or 2 cultivation events to suppress the weeds in that germination zone, which is about 1 to 2 inches. And then behind the tractor, we have these Danish S-tines that cultivate at about 1 inch to 2 inches between the beds. And so we run this through and we feel like we've suppressed the weeds pretty well in that top part of the soil. Then we plant our teff. And when we do it right, this is kind of what the stand density would look like on teff. And you can see in between the rows, we get really great, good weed control out of this living mulch. But this picture is interesting because on the end of the bed here, there was a little skip where the teff went in, and you can see weeds growing in there, very well. And so, the weed pressure is so strong on our farm that we really have to take extra efforts like stale seed bedding and be really mindful of what we can cultivate and where the teff grows. So that's what the teff looks like. And then I want to talk about some more innovations that we've come up with over the years. And one of these is, I think, really works well in our system. And that is to take these hoops that Ajay showed you, these 10-foot EMT conduit hoops that we bend with like a Johnny's hoop bender. And we skew them off at an angle so that they're actually going into the plastic. And this was a farmer idea. And this is, I think, when academic partnerships with farmers where we work with farmers and they come up with ideas and we come up with ideas, it often leads to the best ideas. And this is an example of feedback we got from farmers over the years on the better placement of the hoops. And so in this situation, we're skewing the hoops so that both ends of the hoops actually go onto the plastic. What this allows you to do is manage the ground in between the plastic with equipment. And so you're not running into the hoops, for instance, because when you put the hoops out in the soil, it's very difficult to control weeds or teff or anything where the hoop actually enters into the soil. So this is a way that you can still get the height of the hoop, but skew it off so that then you can manage in between the plastic beds. So you see a couple of views of it right there. And then we've tried, one of the limitations of this system, or one of the labor kind of cost of this system, is securing the edges. Ajay said that this is a way to use exclusion for pest management, and it's an excellent system. But if you have breaches in the system, insects can get in under there. And if they get in under there and there's not predators for them, they do really well. And so it's critical to really secure the edges of the fabric. And you can see a long piece of Protect net down this row here, like a 300-foot section. And we've tried different things over the years, like rock-filled bags or sand-filled bags. And we've also played around with lay flat irrigation line. And so this is like an 1.5 or 2 inch irrigation line. We fill it with water and then we cap the ends, and you can run a long piece down the side of the bed. And, as long as you don't run over this with a mower or whatever, this lay flat will last for a long time. So this is a way that we can get a continuous hold down on the landscape, on the Protect net, versus bags that leave a section in between each one. So just a technique that we've tried that we think has good potential. And then I was going to show you a video here, but I don't know if it's going to work really well, so I'm just going to kind of drag it. And this is how we mow the teff. If you let the teff go too long, or if you're using just a weed, you're just letting weeds grow in between and trying to mow them, you really have to have, I think, an efficient way to manage the intersown cover crop. And I'm going to see if I can just kind of drag this along to show you what this looks like. But what we use is a BCS walk behind tractor that we flip the handles around, walk behind it, and then we put a flail mower. This is a Berta Italian flail mower on the front. And you'll see Katie, the graduate student, Katie Fisk, mowing the teff in between the squash. This is probably like the last mowing we'll do, maybe 1 or 2 mowings per year, depending. And she actually goes under the Protect net. So let's see if I can just kind of drag this and you get an idea of it. I don't know if this is going to work or not. So let me just see here. I thought it was going to work, but it's not going to. The point is that she can mow the cover crop. I'll just kind of fast forward it here. She can mow the cover crop, and then the way this tiller work or this walk behind tractor works with the flow mower in front of it allows you to go in under the row cover material. So here she is entering into the row cover. See it just one sec. You can move the handles down on these walk behind tractors, and she just goes under the row cover and just walks under the row cover. Of course, you couldn't do this if you were a 7-foot tall person, but she's just bending over and going under the row cover. Okay. So this is just another picture of the landscape fabric. And I think this is also an excellent system. Ajay talked about this, and we've done a lot of studies over the years comparing different types of weed control. And so I'm just going to show you some data from 2022 real quickly that compares landscape fabric versus TEF, mowed or unmowed, versus just letting weeds grow and mowing the weeds. And some growers do that. If they don't have tools or techniques to be able to manage the ground in between the plastic, sometimes people will let the weeds grow and then try to mow the weeds. And you can see in this picture, if the hoops were like this and there wasn't landscape fabric there, you couldn't mow this. And so that's where the skewed hoops help. But, you know, landscape fabric, if you want the system that really is going to control weeds, landscape fabric is outstanding. But there are limitations, like I mentioned, and one of the main ones that we have seen over the years is the landscape fabric really needs to come up onto the sides of the plastic. You can see this is a great job in this picture where the landscape fabric actually goes onto the plastic and there is no bare ground left. So this is what you were looking for, is a system like this. So just to quickly to let you know, if we look at 4 treatments, bare ground mowed, the landscape fabric, which is really a kind of a gold standard, the TEF mowed or TEF unmowed, and we look at the weeds, so we extract the weeds out of each one of these treatments. The bare ground obviously has a lot more weeds in it, and TEF, landscape fabric, either mowed or unmowed TEF, are all statistically the same, and that is they have great weed control in them. But how does this translate into marketable yield? So if you look at marketable yield, though, in this 2022 study, you see that landscape fabric has statistically higher marketable yield, so it performs the best, and that makes sense. Really low weed pressure, great yield. But TEF mowed and unmowed versus the bare ground are all statistically the same in terms of marketable yield. So you might look at this and it's like, what's the point in putting the TEF in there? And so I do want to tell you that 2022 in Kentucky was a really tough year. We had a very hot, dry June and July. And so the TEF in this situation wasn't like our best stand of TEF. But what happens, and this is back to my point of there's no perfect system, you can sometimes get competition from cover crops. And we think that maybe TEF can be competing, may have the potential to compete with the actual cash crop under the plastic. And so further research needs to be done to address that. But I do want to make one point here. One of the weaknesses of just allowing weeds to grow, if you were comparing it between that and the TEF, is that if you don't mow the weeds in a timely fashion, and you get rain or whatever, and you can't get the seed heads off of the weeds, you're creating an additional problem. You're adding to your weed seed bank. So I don't think that's as sustainable as a planted cover crop. The trade-off is the TEF costs money and it takes time to put down. But I think there is a balance or a trade-off between these two things. And then also for perennial weeds, just letting weeds grow, I don't think is a really viable option either. So in general, we do not do the bare ground mowed treatment. It's more of an experimental thing that we did here. One last point to make here, and Ajay mentioned this, I think if you look at this system in general, I would view this as kind of an esoteric system. This is quite a complicated, expensive way to control pests in an organic system. But if you can extend the use of this material to other crops, if you're buying it just for cucurbits, I think economically it's definitely, there's a price factor to it. But if you could put it in rotation in spring and fall with other crops, I think you can start to extend the use of it and make it more economically viable. So we're starting to experiment around with how can we rotate Protect Net in our fields to best use it, so we're not doing single season use of it. And so I think there's lots of potential with that in the future, because the system is the important thing, not necessarily the crop. Okay, with that, we'll end.
Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, please open that Q&A portion at the bottom there and type them in. So the first question we got either for you, Ajay or Mark, or one of our other panelists is, where do you purchase your Protect net?
Yeah, so we purchase it here at Iowa State from Dubois Agriculture. They are based in Canada. Jose is the one who usually has placed the order in the past. And I have done it too in some instances. And for that, that's why I have that price, about $1,000 for a 300-foot long and 25 feet wide with the shipping and all that. I mean, the prices are going up in the recent past, but Dubois Agriculture in Canada, that's where we have bought it from. Mark, same place for you also?
That's where we originally started getting it from, and we definitely still buy from them. But I have noticed as Protect Net has become more recognizable by growers or recognized by growers, there are other companies that are starting to sell it. And maybe not in these huge links, but I think even places like Johnny's, I've seen it at AM Leonard in Ohio. There are other companies that are starting to sell it that are United States companies, which could impact shipping costs and things like that. So it is becoming more available.
So is another question we had, is a landscape fabric available in white and black, or white on black? Like, I guess colors availability.
So you saw in the picture, Laura, we used the white on black one that was at a grower site. So it is available. I think it will be a little bit more expensive than the regular black one, but it is available.
So Ajay, just to be clear, that's white on one side, black on the other side?
Correct. But it's it's not very easily available. Either it will be black or it will be white typically.
Okay, and I just want to make note, there's some talk going on with just panelists. Make sure if you're commenting in the chat to select panelists and attendees, because it's some good conversation going on there. But so one of the other question was, when reusing the weed fabric, are there any concerns about disease from the previous crop?
Yeah, and I did put my comments in there. Ideally, we would like to pressure wash it, but come on, at the end of the season, we don't have time for all that. People are busy harvesting and wrapping up the season. But minimum what you can do is definitely brush if you pull the wheat fabric out, just brush the soil out. We sometimes leave it out so that it gets exposed to a little bit of colder temperature, and then we roll them and put them in the barrel. I don't know about much of the disease transmission because mostly it's the insect pests for cucurbit crops. There are some diseases there, definitely. And if you have disease, ideally use that wheat fabric for another crop or another family so that at least you're not transferring. Mark, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, it's back to the point. There's no perfect system. Like, you can control weeds really well with this system, but you need to be aware of what diseases you could be bringing in. I think Ajay brings up a good point there. If you feel like that there's something that could be transmitted on the fabric, you need to be very aware of that. Maybe use it in a different crop, or if you had to and it started to become a problem, you could bleach it, like dunk it into a big tank. The rolls that you roll up, you could dunk them down into bleach. We've gone to extreme levels like that when we've had disease issues. But I don't know of that many studies or any studies that have specifically looked at disease transmission on landscape fabric in cucurbits.
Interesting. And I think you mentioned, Ajay, putting it in the barrel. So our next question was storage methods to protect the net from rodents, particularly I assume over the winter.
And we have taken the same approach we would roll the Protect Net, and Jose can also chime in because he and his students do that on a regular basis in the fall. But we put them in these large drums and we just close the lid on top of the drum. So it's a drum no rodents have access to. So it has to be somewhere where it's safe and not just lying outside, because otherwise definitely there'll be rodent damage. Jose, you want to add anything?
No, I think that's about it. We use those drums and just close it for the winter time.
We use on our farm, not always, but the system we like the most is macro bins. There's these big white plastic macro bins, they're called, and then you can buy lids to them. They're quite large. You move them with forklift, and you can put a lot of material in those.
Excellent. And I'm checking through the chat. Again, it's a little, be sure to put questions in the Q&A, but it looks like we also had a question in the chat that last year and other farming friends of mine had a tough year with cucumber beetles and squash bugs. Is there anything we can do now to our soil in the fall to help us spring, summer next year? Should I wait till we jump to the entomologists? Okay, Angie, the next speakers will be the entomologists, so we'll let them handle that one, and we won't stump our horticulture friends.
You guys know how to stay in your lane.
With that one. So no, that was an excellent segue. So we'll move to our next speakers. Rick and Dave are going to discuss cucurbit pollinations. So do you guys want to discuss soil and squash bugs and cucumber beetles first?
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and that, I think one thing that goes along with managing insects and diseases is, as soon as you're done harvesting a crop, is rapid sanitation. And particularly with squash bugs and cucumber beetles, after you harvest the fruit, they're going to continue to feed on the plant. They're going to be storing nutrients that they can overwinter with. Particularly with squash bugs, if you completely destroy that crop quickly, you can remove the food from some of the nymphs and keep them from becoming adults that can successfully overwinter. So I think really timely, effective fall sanitation will help.
Excellent. And I will let you guys get started. I just remind all our attendees, again, write any questions into that Q&A session, and any of our panelists can, feel free, if you have more, weed questions and things like that, you can go ahead and type that in, and Ajay or Mark can type in answers in that. So we love all the participation, but I'll let you guys talk to us about pollination.
Okay, so I'm going to start off, and Dave's going to take over after a few slides here. But so, what we're talking about is a really new system for organic production of these cucurbit crops. And, since we're talking about a system, we're having to deal with new ways to look at, weed control, which they just discussed. We're also looking at new ways that we can manage pollination on this crop. So Dave, with the next slide, please. So this is really a tough crop to grow. I mean, we have a lot of key insect and disease pests that both can limit the yield and quality of the crops we're growing. So it is really a challenge compared to some other vegetable crops. One issue that conventional growers have been with pollinator protection. A lot of the insecticides we've used in the past by conventional growers have pollination protection risks associated with them. So with the next slide. So, I think they covered this well, the system that we're working with, the Protec, or, some sort of net over the crop and the hoops and all that. And that's really good at excluding the key insect pests, the cucumber beetles, the squash bug, and the squash vine borer. But the other issue, it also is excluding a number of beneficial insects that could feed on secondary pests, and also it's excluding our pollinators on this crop. But what we have seen when we manage it correctly, we've seen some really good yields as compared to the traditional way of managing these crops with organic insecticides. So next slide, please. So, and I hope I'm not getting too basic with this, but just so everyone understands what's needed in terms of pollination with these cucurbit crops, that all the cucurbit species have separate male and female flowers on the plant. And so plants will produce a number of male flowers and a number of female flowers. These flowers are open for a single day. Actually had a student test this and went out and was looking at various species on a daily basis to make sure that they were only open for a single day. A lot of times with some of these, like squash, they may open the flowers at 4 in the morning and close them by 10 in the morning, but they're only open for a single day. What is interesting is this group of vegetables is completely dependent upon insect pollinators, meaning if you don't have insect pollinators, you don't get any fruit. It's as simple as that. So gender matters here, and I'm showing these slides here just to show you what the male and female flowers look like. So on the top slide there, you see a acorn squash female flower, and right below the flower, you can see what is going to turn into the acorn squash fruit. The flower below, that's a male flower, and you see it doesn't have that that small developing fruit below it. It's just on a straight stalk below that. It's very important with this system to be able to recognize the difference between male and female flowers, because a lot of times, particularly in years when we're slow getting our transplants out, you may have transplants that already have flowers on them, but they're most likely the male flowers, because the male flowers generally come out well in advance, weeks in advance of when those female flowers begin to appear. Why it's important to recognize that time period is when we start to see female flowers on most of the plants, we know that's the time that we need to have some sort of pollination technique in place to produce a crop. So I just wanted to show you the next slide, just who our pollinators are on these crops. And so this is some data on melons, and you can see bumblebees, bombus are very important. Apis mellifera, that's our honeybee. We have small black bees. There's several dozen species there, as well as those small green bees. And another one we have, at least here in Kentucky, is the Mesotunnels bimaculata. It's a really fast black bee that seems to be very important. The next slide shows what we have on squash plants. And so this is with acorn squash. And with acorn squash, a couple things to note, that the bumblebees tend to be incredibly important on some of these squash flowers. The other pollinator that shows up is the squash bee, Pepinapis prunosa. So it does not pollinate melon plants, but it does pollinate squash plants. And you can see honeybees, Apis mellifera, are there, but they're not nearly as common as they are in the small flowered cucurbit plants. And again, we have some small black bees, and there's some others that are coming in there. So that's how often they're coming by. The last slide I was going to show is just generally what they're doing when they show up. And on this slide, what we did is we actually covered flowers before they opened, and then we took the cover off the flower after they were open, and we waited for a single bee to come and visit the flower, and then we closed it up again. So it was just one visitation from a single bee species. Then at harvest, we counted the number of seed in the fruit, and the idea was to try and figure out which of the pollinators may be more important as pollinators than other pollinators. And you can see in this graph, hopefully you can see that the legend down at the bottom, but the bar on the left would be flowers that have no cover. So they were open for the entire season or the entire pollination period. And so that was just wild pollinators. So that's sort of our standard of about 325 seeds. Then as you go through, you see the next is where we keep the cover on the flower. And that's without insect pollination, you get nothing. The flowers abort. The next bar would be the bumblebees, followed by the other bees you have in the system. The last bar on the right, that would be the honeybee, Apis mellifera. And you might think, well, Apis mellifera is not very important, but where people are bringing lots of these bees into areas, they can be important just because their sheer number and their visitation rates. Now, not all these bees do well underneath row covers. So, for example, honeybees do not do well. Bumblebees, we have used those in the past, and they're very good pollinators underneath row cover. So at this point, I'm going to hand this over to Dave.
Thanks, Rick. So the big question for trying to manage these bees is really whether you're going to try to use so the wild pollinators that exist on your farm in large numbers, or whether you want to try to purchase commercial bumblebee hives as another opportunity to introduce to the Mesotunnel system. And the way we feel about this, or the take-home message, is really that there's probably no exact perfect system. Each farm is different. And really it's a balance between what Ajay and Mark were talking about with how you're going to need to manage weeds, what kind of resources or availability of labor you have, and really what pest and disease pressure you have. I also wanted to quickly give a shout out to Katie Fisk, Lexi Gauger, and Robert Brockman, that at least for the last 3 years have been largely pushing this work forward, at least here in the University of Kentucky. So what I want to do is quickly just walk through the different strategies that we've been studying and mimicking from some of the farmers that we work with and trying to develop alternative methods. But really to visualize these, you have to imagine the developmental time of these squash and melon plants from an early development, either right after they start germinating, if you direct seeded, or if you transplanted, that period where they're actually very susceptible to pest damage. And as they produce flowers some weeks later, and then at the end, that fruit development. And so probably the most basic, or I call it the minimalist strategy, is what we call the on-off strategy. And that's really just trying to focus on that early season development, covering your plants then, and then taking them off as you start to see those female flowers forming on the plants. And this strategy introduces the wild pollinators to the system, and so they're free. And most farms that we've been on, we've seen pretty high visitation rates of different species, bumblebees or honeybees, or these native bees Rick we're talking about. And so that's usually actually really great pollination. The challenge here, though, is that as you take those nets off, really you're exposing these plants to a lot of pests. And so I'm kind of going through a pros and cons list here, but the key thing here is you're protecting them early on when they're most vulnerable. And this also allows you to quickly get in there to manage weeds, and if you need to, or to utilize different kinds of things, like if you have to straddle those beds with a tractor, you can take the hoops out and get at them very quickly. It's also less labor intensive. And one other really great pro about this strategy, as Ajay was alluding to, or Mark, is you can then quickly use these nets for something else in your farm that could benefit from a row cover system or a mesotunnel system. The cons, though, are really that this system is exposing your crops to pests for a longer period of time. You may need to combine this strategy with a few organic insecticide applications. And it's not going to provide that full season protection from the pathogens that can be transmitted by cucumber beetles and squash bugs. There is one farmer that we've worked with that has really taken this minimalist strategy even further, that just by laying down the fabric without hoops and without weights, this is something that you can do very quickly. And if you're going to take the net off within a couple weeks, it's something that you can avoid damaging the net by having weeds grow through that fabric. And so that is something that if you're don't have a great weight system, that might be something that could benefit you. But scaling this up a little bit, one strategy we've focused on a lot is an on-off-on strategy, where provides you basically protection early on during that development of the crops. You take the nets off during flowering, and then once you feel flowering is complete, you can put those nets back on. And so this strategy probably provides you with a little more protection throughout the season. It also, again, is taking advantage of those wild bees that are already present on your farm. And it also gives you some access to get into your fields completely when you have to manage those weeds. The challenge and one benefit is that we'll talk about in a bit is that as you completely exclude plants throughout the whole season, you can have some secondary pest issues with things like aphids in melons, especially, and being able to take those nets off also allows natural enemies like ladybugs to access them and control them. I think the big thing here in terms of the potential cons is that you still are exposing the plant to those pests that you're using the netting to prevent. And so you can have some buildup over time and some sense almost trapping them as you close the nets back up. But it can reduce the amount of insecticide applications that you may have to use or you may not need to at all. But if you do have lots of wilt or high pressure from Cucurbit yellowcline divine, Cucurbit yellow vine decline, this may again possibly not be the best strategy. And you do have to also add a slightly amount more of labor to take off the net entirely. And so we have been playing around with a slight modification of this treatment, which we call the open end strategy, where instead of taking the net entirely off at flowering, we simply open up the ends and either clip the net to the hoops or kind of tie it up in a way that just really opens up the ends of a long tunnel. And what we found is that the pollinators, the wild pollinators, especially bumblebees, don't really care too much about the netting. So they will find their way very quickly into your nets and even up towards 120, 150 foot long tunnels, we see that they're actually finding their way all the way throughout. And then after flowering, you can close the nets down. And so we think that this is a strategy that the pollinators seem pretty capable of finding their way in. Some pests do as well, but perhaps it provides a little bit more protection compared to taking the nets completely off during the flowering stage. It does reduce a little bit of labor in having to take the nets all the way off. But I'd say that the cons are very similar to the on-off-on strategy. The only thing that's probably a little bit different is that because you're leaving the net on most of the tunnel, it's tricky to get in there to use a tractor or some sort of push mower, and so weed management can be trickier here. And so that's where you saw the video of Katie using a flail mower to go through the underneath the nets, and that's something that we've tried and it works great for smaller folks. I'm not sure Rick could do that. He's pretty tall actually. So the last strategy here is the full season strategy with commercial bumblebees. This is where you purchase from companies like Cloppert colonies of bumblebees that are, I think, about $125 to $150, and you introduce them as the crop begins to flower. We usually put them on top of something like a center block so that they're not contacting the plastic, and as it rains, the box doesn't get wet. And then we also put a laundry basket or some sort of cover over top of the box so that it doesn't get saturated during rains. And these commercial bumblebees will be happy to go out and forage throughout the tunnel. We found that they do a great job. We're at least most of the time at medium-sized tunnels. It's still unclear exactly how large of a tunnel one colony can provide pollination to. And And so this is a great strategy if you have issues with some of the pathogens that are transmitted by pest problems or extremely high pest pressure, because basically you're providing that entire full season of exclusion, but also in introducing these bumblebees. It's also great because you're unlikely to have to really spray for any of these pests using this system. But some of the challenges here are really that you're going to be excluding everything for that whole time. So you really have to have an advanced weed management strategy. Something like landscape fabric might be a better avenue here. Another con can be that some of these secondary pests can really be completely protected from those natural enemy communities. And so it may be worth thinking about trying to purchase ladybugs or lacewing larvae that you could introduce into these mesotunnels. And the one thing that's great about doing that is that they are actually trapped within there too, so they won't fly away to other fields. They'll focus on what you've given them. And the last con is that these bumblebee colonies are actually quite expensive, so you're really going to have to make sure that you're getting enough of a yield benefit to make it worth it. And so from our research, what we've found over the last few years, I'm showing mostly data here from Kentucky with larger plots of about 120 feet, where we compared these strategies. And these first graphs are from acorn squash. And what's interesting is that the open ends treatment actually was the best treatment, at least in 2020. But across years, we see variation. In 2021, we really didn't find a real difference between those different treatments, but the full season tended to be better in that year. And at Iowa State, some of the students there found quite similar trends for acorn squash. But things are slightly different for muskmelon, where here in Kentucky, we also found an on-off or an open-end strategy was probably the best strategy for us. But mainly the issue here was the full season. Those stock bees did not perform that well in this particular year. And this is kind of contrary because at Iowa State for muskmelons, they've actually found that the full season tends to be better in most of the seasons that they've conducted these experiments. And so what we really feel is that it's kind of a choose your own adventure, and there may be no single best option, but it really comes down to what you have at your farm in terms of resources, labor, and pest problems and disease problems, and as well as weed management strategies. So on-off is the most flexible if you have a need for utilizing different kinds of equipment that you can't, you need to get the hoops out of the field to do that. The on-off on or the open ends treatment might be best if you have high pest pressure but don't really have a lot of the pathogens. But if you have those pathogens, you may want to consider this full season strategy and try to purchase these bumblebees that may provide you the best protection from those pathogens. And so, yeah, I guess with that, I'd just like to real quick thank a lot of the crew that has worked on the UK team, but also our collaborators at Cornell and Iowa State that aren't present here, as well as the USDA. And so I guess we can take some questions now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rick and Dave. And thank you, everyone. There's a number of questions being typed into the Q&A, and I'll read those off. And Ajay and Mark are still with us too. So if you have any other questions about that, feel free to type it in. So the first one is for you, Rick. What was the methodology for monitoring the bee species in the flowers?
Okay, so those were timed visual counts. So we had someone, and they would go through, I forget exactly how many stations there were in the field. It was like 30 or 40 stations, and they would wait at each of those stations and record the number of bees in a square meter for about a minute. And so those were assessed. It was done on 8 different farms, commercial farms, throughout Kentucky. So that's how we did the bee visitation. Obviously, the seed counts that was we used little bags that we put over the flowers, and then at the end of the year we would harvest the fruit and carefully go through there and count the number of viable seeds.
Excellent. And I think this question for either one of you, what are your thoughts on cucumber beetle or other insect pollination during very early season flowering? In Vermont, there were very few bees in and out of flowers during the first plantings and flowerings. Once squash bees were out, lots of other bee activities until probably the last week of August, first week of September.
So the question is, are squash bees, are cucumber beetles an important pollinator early in the season? I don't know. I don't think that's been documented. It concerns me just because that is the critical time of year when they can transmit the bacteria that causes bacterial wilt to those very young plants, very young seedlings, and those that become infected early often exhibit the most severe symptoms with those pathogens. And so I'm not sure that the trade-off between a slight benefit with pollination would offset exposing them to the cucumber beetles early in the year.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I have heard people say that there is some people think that they can act as pollinators. I haven't seen a great study that has really kind of compared that. And so, yeah, it's an interesting observation, or whether there could be some other bees that are not as obvious still floating around, but yeah, interesting thought.
And the next question was, how many commercial bumblebee colonies did you use per the area pollinated? The colonies last all season, or how many weeks were they out in the field?
So for the system we've been working on the last couple of years, the fields are about 21 feet wide, which is 3 beds on 7-foot centers, and they're 120 feet long, and I believe Iowa State has been doing 150 feet long beds, and 1 colony of these bumblebees has been used for that. For our experiments, we haven't tried to see if a 300-foot row, for example, could be used. We have seen some evidence that the pollination rate, like the data Rick showed of the seed number per fruit, tends to go down a little bit at this scale compared to the wild pollination. And so we believe at this scale, perhaps a colony is starting to get maxed out. They don't do super well for long periods of time underneath those row covers. It's actually brings up a very interesting point that they believe squash pollen is actually not a very great resource for bumblebees, but they do use the nectar. And so, but they will be fine after a few weeks during flowering. You can use those boxes for something else, and that's actually possibly a great use of them.
And kind of related, I mean, are you seeing farmers in your areas typically using commercially purchased bumblebees in cucurbit production at all yet?
Rick, I have not seen very many farmers using this on their own in cucurbits with the row cover or Meso Tunnel system. For other uses, they've been using them for greenhouses a lot, I think. But Rick, I'm not sure, you have more growers than I do.
I would just add that obviously the growers that have been cooperators on the project have been testing this along with on our farms. Bumblebees are used a lot in greenhouse tomato crops, and I've actually seen situations where commercial growers have used them in open peach orchards where they just haven't had any pollinators out there, and they purchased some. But no, I haven't seen commercial growers on their own use them for cucurbit pollination.
So I can add just a little bit of information. So Mark Gleason, myself, and Don Lewis here at Iowa State, we do work with some of the Amish and the Mennonite growers in Kelowna, Iowa. And last year, when we went to the field day, the Twilight Produce Walk, they were using bumblebees. They had 2 hives on, it was a relatively larger field on both ends, and and I asked them what's the cost, and if I'm not wrong, with the shipping and all included, each box was about $250 to $300, maybe a little more, but somewhere in that range. But they were very happy to use that because they were getting better pollination, better fruit set, and they were happy, using that. So there are growers who do use that.
Excellent. Another question was, what is your favorite organic insecticide used for cucumber beetles and squash bugs?
It's, just the term "what's my favorite," and that's not what I would usually refer to favorites among insecticides. But I think what among organic production, we've used different insecticides over the years. We've used spinosad-based products like Entrust. We've used kale and clay. We've used Azera, the neem oil, pyrethrum based products, and generally we have had fair to good results with all those. It would be nice if they were more effective. If they were very effective, we wouldn't go to the time and expense of using the Protect netting. So I mean, the reason why we pushed on with this research is that these have not been very robust insecticides for cucumber beetle and squash bug control.
Very good. And then a question probably for you, David. Did you notice a marketable yield gradient with distance from the open ends, the treatment? So were the bees like pollinating better close to the open end, or did you not notice any difference at all?
Right. No, we didn't. So with the open ends treatment, the bees only have access on the ends. So you might think that pollination or fruit set would be greater towards those edges, but we did not see that. We found that at least the visitation rate and yield was pretty consistent through all with that. And on the other side, you might expect if you put a bumblebee box inside your tunnel, in the center, those areas close to that bumblebee box might get more pollination than on the very edges. But we didn't see, at least in Kentucky, we did not see that the bumblebees were staying too close to their box. They do get around and move around the whole tunnel pretty easily.
Very good. I believe that's all the questions that we have. I'll just give another minute if anyone has anything to type in. Is there anything else oh, we did have one more question for Mark. Does the living tuff mulch cause any hassle when it comes time to pull up the plastic mulch?
Well, I would say it depends on the type of tools that you have. And so we use a plastic lifter made by Rainflow. Our tractor's powerful enough to pull through it without any problems. So it's going to be condition dependent also. If we've gone through a real wet period, the soil where the tuff is tends to hold moisture more. And so if you're familiar with plastic lifters, where the sides that hold the cutter bars go in, sometimes they'll bind up with soil in those areas, or where the cutter bars go in, they'll start to bind up with soil. But with the right soil conditions, we don't have a problem with pulling up plastic and winding it up. We wind up our plastic on a reel when we pull it up. But I could see in some conditions, especially if you didn't have the right horsepower or you were in a muckier soil, we're in a loam soil, so it works pretty well for us. But like I was saying earlier, there's no perfect system. Everything has strengths and challenges to it, and it depends on the technology, the tools, the labor, and the environment at different farms. But in our hands, it's not been an issue.
Very good. And we just received another, more I think of a comment than a question, that if pests are less likely to make their way into an open end tunnel than pollinators are, perhaps it's worth testing an open end sacrifice ends. I like that method. So kind of like the ends serve almost as a trap crop. So just kind of a suggestion of some other options to try.
Yeah, that's actually something we've been wondering about, how, or even putting some sort of non-attractive crop on the ends, so that you know, the ideas of like companion planting with something that's might not send a cue that to go in that way for cucumber beetles or things like that. But interesting idea.
It is. There's no anything else any of you like to add that we haven't covered? If not, I thank you all so much. I really appreciated this. I learned a lot from it. And just for anyone watching, we will have the recording available within a few weeks, and you will get an email notification of that when the recording is available. And just know that our next Pest in Progress webinar will be on November 16th at 12:30 Central Time, when we're going to switch gears and discuss sudden death syndrome on soybeans, the risk of management with Dr. David Mueller from Iowa State University. So again, watch for those emails, check out the recording, and then you should have links to where you can check out our website and register for upcoming webinars. So thank you all so much.